Welcome to Diplomatic Changemakers off the record, where diplomacy gets real. I'm your host, Wiola, bringing you unfiltered stories from top diplomats and global changemakers. If you're driven to make an impact, this is your front row seat. Welcome to Diplomatic Changemakers off the record, the space where we leave the press releases and panel bios at the door and get real with people shaping international diplomacy from the inside out. Over the past 15 years, Charlotte Goemans has built an incredible career at the intersection of development cooperation and diplomacy. She's worked within the OECD and across three major UN agencies: the International Labour Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Trusted as a strategic advisor, she supported governments across Africa and the Middle East, navigating sensitive political landscapes and topics such as gender, and designing high-stakes programs that connect policy to real-world impact. Charlotte has led and negotiated development programs in Africa and the Middle East, often in spaces where global ambitions meet local complexity and where diplomacy demands clarity, courage, and more than a little persistence. From removing children from labor in Tanzania to shaping multi-million euro initiatives on women's economic empowerment in the MENA region, her work reflects both depth and range. What makes her stand out isn't just the scope of her portfolio, it's the way she's built her path, moving fluidly from grassroots programming to high-level policy, always acquiring the skills needed to meet the moment. In the past decade, she's authored and peer-reviewed key publications on gender and development. And actually, this is how we met. She reviewed my very first OECD publication on women and girls in fragile context, which was a huge milestone for me. So thank you for being a part of that process. And Charlotte's career started with a deliberate decision not to become a lawyer, choosing purpose over predictability and learning to navigate systems that often reward staying in line more than speaking up. But behind the impressive CV is the part that we don't often talk about: navigating single motherhood while managing a high-pressure global career, facing the invisible weight of gender politics, professional competition, and the quiet compromises that come with staying in the game. We're diving into it all today: the pivots, the passion, the moments of boldness, and the hard questions that keep coming back. If the field were truly fair for women and for all underrepresented groups, how would diplomacy shift? What would it look like for women to lead without constantly battling gendered expectations and obstacles? Charlotte Goemans for us today, off the record. Welcome.
Thank you, Wiola, for this nice introduction.
As a child, did you want to become a lawyer? Is that why you pursued a law degree?
I come from a family of lawyers, and so often when we were at family meetings or Christmas parties, it was a big topic. People only talking about legal cases and courts. So it's what I was familiar with, and it's what I grew up with. The other thing that kind of shaped my decision to study law was also from a very young age, I was very sensitive to situations of injustice. When I was in primary school, we had in my class some refugees from the former Yugoslavia, and then in high school, there were some refugee children having come from Rwanda. And I was always the one volunteering to sit next to them or teach them the language, because I just felt that these situations really touched me. When it was time to choose my studies, law was one of the options, but I wasn't quite sure, because I was also very interested in other languages, other cultures, and I was hesitating to maybe study Arabic or Chinese at the university. At that age, it's so difficult to decide what you're going to do the rest of your life. I spoke with my friends, I spoke with my family, and I realized that it's actually when you're not sure, it's better to choose something that's a bit broader so that you can still narrow down afterwards. And then my grandmother was the one who made that final decision for me. She just said, "Le droit mène à tout," which means something like the law can take you anywhere. And I think in my case, that is what happens.
My mom used to say the same thing, which is why I started studying law as well. But then I realized that I'm so much more interested in international relations that I switched after a year. But the thinking behind it was also that if you have a law degree, you can do a lot of things after it. You don't need to be a lawyer. I even remember telling my mom that maybe at some point I would want to go into politics or into international diplomacy. She said, but look, there's so many presidents that finished law. Which is true. A lot of them have a really strong legal background. And did you ever imagine yourself in international relations and in diplomacy at that stage of your life?
To be honest, it has always been an interest of mine. I was always following the news when things came up about geopolitics. I was interested, but I never thought I would have actually the chance to be in that environment, because to me it was very far from my daily reality. But once I started my law studies, I realized that I was not that interested in law in itself, especially not just Belgian types of legislation and all the different elements there, investment law, tax law, and so on. But for me, it was not an option to quit my studies, because my parents always said that they delivered their children with 3 assets, which is a university degree, driver's license, and table manners.
That's a good one.
Yes, and I'm actually very glad that they did. So I just had to finish my studies. I knew it was not an option to quit, but actually in the final years of my law studies, there was a kind of a turning point, because finally we came to learning the interesting stuff about international law, human rights, and it really resonated with me. That's where I became passionate about this, and I knew I wanted to work in that sphere. Then I got the opportunity to do the last few months of my studies in an Erasmus program in Rome, in Italy, and then I found out that actually some of the UN Rome-based agencies are there. And so this is really where things started moving for me.
I bet, coming back to the 3 assets that your parents gave you, table manners are very useful when working in diplomacy.
In any setting of life.
In any setting of life, true. How did that law degree then prepare you to entering those organizations in Rome? And what were the key skills that you were able to showcase to get your first position then?
Of course, the topic of Belgian law in itself wasn't useful, but I think being at university and doing a more broader type of degree, it's also shaping you as a person. And it's about seeing the bigger picture in complex situations. It's about being methodical. It's also about gaining insights in topics like the economy and history. So I think that broad base, it prepared me actually quite well for the next steps. And I have to say that throughout my career, actually, I used my legal backgrounds. For example, when I was doing fieldwork in Rwanda, I was assessing how the traditional courts that had been set up after the genocide actually contributed to more equal societies. I had also worked when I was at the International Labour Organization on some of the ILO conventions, so the international legal frameworks, and how countries are actually implementing this international law into their national frameworks. At the OECD, I've also used my legal background working on legal frameworks to enhance women's economic empowerment in countries in the Middle East and North Africa. So I have to say that this background has been quite useful throughout my career.
Not only in terms of the methodology and analysis that you have from the law degree, but also in particular cases for some of the programming, some of the codes that you have mentioned. It's really interesting. You must have been very proud to be just like, oh, I know this from the degree that I didn't necessarily like for all these years.
Yes, it did come in handy, and I was in the end glad that I finished it, even though it was 5 years, which was very long at the time for me.
This is why I decided to change my degree, because law in Poland is also 5 degrees. And after the first year that I have finished, I decided to take a year off to get into international relations and to study in the UK. I would have finished it if it was 3 years, but 5 years is just such a big chunk of life, and I felt that I want to be doing something that I'm more aligned with. I had a presentation at that university that I studied at just a week ago when I was in Poland, and a lot of people asked me, do you regret leaving? And I say, no, I don't regret it at all, because I'm very happy with the decisions that I have made. But at the same time, if I stayed, I would have still been able to have an international career. The message maybe for people who are studying law and don't like it is that you can still finish your degree and still have an international career.
Yes, you can, but also picking up on something that you've mentioned, that you took a year to gain practical experience. It's something that didn't really exist when I was studying. I think that's actually very helpful to young people, because when you arrive at the workplace, basically you don't know anything. So just those basic skills of how to behave behave in the workplace, how to send emails, how to organize meetings. It's helpful if you already acquire those skills when you're younger, when you're still at university.
I was actually working as a nanny. Even though it doesn't sound that it was a very useful job, it was super useful because it gave me a lot of emotional intelligence, because you work with parents, and obviously when you take care of somebody's children, it's the most precious thing that they have. So you really learn how to be client oriented, and I think that was a really good training for me. And I did that actually throughout all of my studies in the UK. So I was nannying for 4 years.
I fully agree that that must have been really useful for, I think, the next steps in your life. And I think in general, it's important to do any kind of job when you're studying.
Yes.
I was working in restaurants, in shops, and it's also how you develop yourself as a person and understand the value of money.
Yeah, so you finished your legal studies and then you got into agriculture. How? Can you tell us the story?
When I graduated, I was still in Rome, right? Because I had finished my Erasmus program and I just wanted to stay in Rome. Even if I'm gonna work in a pizzeria, I need to find a way to stay in this fantastic city where there is good food, people enjoy life, there's just so much beauty. I'm also a bit of a nerd because I studied ancient Greek and Latin in high school, so for me there couldn't be any more interesting place in the world than Rome. I had this dream, of course, of working at the UN offices, especially FAO, because it's the center of the city, so I often walked by and I was always in awe of seeing like all these people go there and work there every day. And I actually got lucky because I was sending my CVs to all my contacts that I could find on the website of the UN agencies. I sent my CV to my university and asking them if they knew anyone there, if they could help me. And my CV got picked up by the head of the procurement department at the International Fund for Agriculture Development, because at the time they needed someone with a legal background who spoke different languages. I just got lucky. I wasn't interested in procurement, but I was so happy with this opportunity and I just had to take it.
So you started with procurement, and it was thanks to your language skills and your legal background that you were picked up from the crowd. And then what happened after that?
My supervisor was really a fantastic person and he encouraged me to be part of the interns network and to go to all types of presentations. This is what I did. I networked to the maximum. And one day I attended this presentation of another department of the organization, which was around working with underprivileged groups, very vulnerable groups in sub-Saharan African countries. They worked with people living with HIV/AIDS, disabled people in rural areas. You can imagine it was very specific target group. And they also had a focus on gender equality, which at the time, especially in agricultural programs, wasn't common at all. After the presentation, I approached the head of that department. We talked about many different things. And then he said, why don't we continue your internship in my department? So I actually finished my internship there. And then again, I got lucky because actually the focus of my internship, and then later on it morphed into a consultancy, was to work on gender in those agricultural projects and in rural areas. I started doing very long field missions because we had to design these programs, we had to implement them, we had to evaluate them. For me, it was a real eye-opener, and I think this is really where I understood what development cooperation is all about. I was in very remote areas. There were almost no other UN agencies, perhaps few NGOs here and there, but even that was quite rare. For me, it was the reality check, and seeing that extreme poverty, it really did something to me. I felt that this is the reason why I want to do this job. Even if it's gonna be a very small contribution, I want to be part of a solution for improving the living conditions of people in these places. This type of fieldwork, I can say that it's not for everyone. Often we were in places we didn't eat all day because there was just no food, was no electricity, no running water. But it's the only way, I think, to understand what is happening in these types of countries. context.
First, you got in because you were lucky in a sense. Your CV got picked up and you got your first step in. But then it was through networking that you managed to shift your internship to then find a passion for development. And here you are. A lot of people ask me how to get in. Your example is a common one where people have an internship and then they find out about all of the other projects. So then they're able to talk to the managers or maybe talk to other interns and to really understand what are the other options. Because again, even with, for example, my job at the OECD, something like crisis context and fragility at the time, even though I studied security and conflict, did not know existed. And it was through someone who did an internship in a section that was sitting right next to crisis and fragility, told me about the section. And I was like, how could I not know about this? Because on the websites, everything is super disorganized. So it's really through people that you gain the majority of information about what's going on, what are the projects, what are the budgets.
This is a very important piece of advice, that not to be shy and just speak to other people.
So then you did another shift from agriculture to child labor and entrepreneurship. How and why did you move to ILO in Tanzania?
After the Rome experience, I wanted to further evolve in my career, and I felt like there weren't that many opportunities in Rome to do that. Because I think, like most young people, you get stuck in these short-term consultancy roles, and so there's no longer-term vision for your career. And at the time, I just had my daughter, and I wanted more job stability. But then I also realized that it would be so important for me to work in a country office or in a field office, or on the other hand, to gain high-level policy experience. So I still had those two goals in mind. And I decided to apply for the Junior Professional Officer program. It's really a great opportunity for young people because these programs are basically supporting young people to make a career within international organizations, mostly the UN system. I applied for two different positions. One was with UN Women in New York to be the advisor of the deputy director, and the other position was with the ILO in the sub-regional office based in Tanzania, but also covering other countries in the Great Lakes region to work on child labor and on youth employment. And I got lucky again because I got selected for both positions. And so I had to make the choice, and I decided to go to Tanzania because I realized that the field experience was very important.
You said that this is the time where you had your daughter, so you moved to Tanzania with your small baby.
Yes, I did. She was just under 1 year old at the time.
Wow. So that must have been hard to choose between New York and Tanzania and deciding to go to Tanzania.
Yes, but I think I followed my gut feeling. It was a combination of different types of reflections because, of course, doing that high-level policy work in New York sounded super exciting and people thought I was crazy. Like, why are you going to Tanzania? You get the opportunity to go to New York. It was like the holy grail. But I knew that in that type of position, I wouldn't have any time for my family because when you're attached to a deputy director, you're attached to that person. So you have to follow the person's schedule, which is 24/7. I said at this stage in my career also it's more important to work in the fields. And that policy type of work, it can come later in my career. So that's how I made the decision.
I'm very jealous of all the countries that do offer JPOs because Poland doesn't. I always need to look for real jobs. There's no leeway of maybe less competition because it's only national until a certain age or for a specific level. I'm very jealous that you got to experience that.
I think more countries should open up these opportunities, but for Belgium as well, the number of positions has been dropping. But I think it's such an important opportunity for young people also because you get like a training budget. So every year you can pick a training that you want to do. So it's also about developing your skills. And when you're a JPO, you have a special status within the organization because they also know that your country is financing you. So they have also to respect that relation with the country and they have to give you good opportunities because they want to keep getting JPOs for their organization.
If you've ever dreamt of working at the UN, EU, or NGOs, you already know. It's not easy. The competition is fierce, the job market is complex, and the recruitment process? Let's just say it's not always as fair and transparent as we'd like to believe. I know this because I've been there. I spent years trying to break into international organizations, facing rejections after rejections until I finally cracked the code. I worked at the UN, EU, and the OECD, and along the way, I realized something. The biggest reason so many talented people struggle isn't because they are not qualified. It's because they don't know the rules of the game. That's why I created IO Ready, International Organizations Ready, and the career coaching program for IOs and NGOs designed to give you the insider knowledge, strategies, and confidence to land your dream job in international organizations. It's a step-by-step roadmap tailored specifically to IOs and NGOs. And here is a secret most people don't realize. Getting in isn't just about qualifications. It's about strategy. I'll show you how to think like a recruiter, position yourself as the ideal candidate, and navigate the process with confidence. So if you're serious about working in international organizations, stop guessing and start strategizing. Visit www.io-ready.com to sign up now. Spots are limited, so don't wait.
What trainings did you decide to do at the time? Was it also very strategic?
I think it was a combination of different choices. For example, I decided to do one training in Geneva, and it was more about how the ILO is functioning, what are some of the core ILO conventions, like how you should be applying this in your work. So to better understand the functioning and the core mandate of that particular organization, because I knew being in the field, yes, you would be exposed to the reality of things, but you wouldn't get that broader vision of what the organization is doing. And then I took some other very specific trainings on social protection, on child labor, youth entrepreneurship, because those were some of the topics that I was working on at the time.
So you kept developing your knowledge and your skills related to the job and the specific organization that you were at the time.
Yes.
When you had your experience in Tanzania, how was your next level of thinking about your career, of what you want to do with that experience moving on?
I learned really a lot of things from that experience. I was there almost for 5 years, so it was a significant amount of time to be in that environment. What I learned was really how to work with governments, with African governments in that particular case, and understanding their realities, how to actually serve their agenda, but also influence it. Sometimes you learn these things like from experience and like the hard way, because when I first arrived in the office, they told me, oh, so you've taken over all these portfolios, now you need to meet with your counterparts in the Ministry of Labor, and then you can start developing further that portfolio. So I sent an email to the contact person, no reply.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So I said, okay, I asked advice to colleagues. I said, how can I reach this person? They don't reply to emails. How will they reply to me? You have to send an official letter, then that letter, the office car has to deliver it to the ministry, and then when it gets to the ministry, it actually has to go to the right person. So all this process is already taking 2 to 3 weeks, okay? Then actually it reached the right person. The person then finally sent me a letter back, and then we managed to have a meeting. It was the first time that I arrived in the Ministry of Labor in Dar es Salaam. I got to the building, it was so chaotic, and people didn't have computers, most of them. There were no printers. There was no air conditioning in the blistering heat. So you wouldn't expect that if you haven't been in this environment, that this is how they have to operate with all these types of constraints. So how are you going to do the work properly in that type of environment? And it was very helpful for me to gain those insights and that patience, and to respect also the work that they are doing in these conditions. What I learned there also was a lot about fundraising and partnerships. When I inherited some of my portfolios, they were dying because nobody had been looking after them. So I said, how can we revive this? And I started working with other UN agencies to pool funding. I started also also working with the private sector to mobilize funding from a company, from a foundation. I started doing South-South cooperation between Brazil and Tanzania. And so I learned how to manage those types of relationships. To me, it's always more about building those relationships and those partnerships rather than just the money. The money comes later on. I also learned how to manage staff. When I arrived in that office, I was, I think, around 27 years old, so I was quite young. And I had to manage these senior people, senior local staff. And so I had to gain their respect. I had to be every day not telling them what to do, but having the vision where we were gonna go. I also learned what it means to be in charge, not only when things are going well, but also when things are not going that well, and then how to have hard conversations with people. In that environment, I also learned a lot of things outside of work, important life lessons, because in those environments, life and death are very close to each other. You see people die in car accidents because there are no ambulances. People die of malaria because there are no mosquito nets, or in the area where they live, there are no medicine, there are no hospitals. I learned a lot from the resilience of people and accepting what life is throwing your way.
It sounds that you found the fulfillment from this sense of injustice that you felt from such a young age, and you were able to see it even closer, but then do something about it because of the position that you were in.
Yes, and I think a lot of people are very skeptical and cynical about development cooperation. Or it's not changing anything. I don't know why you are going to these places. There's a lot of corruption. The money never arrives to the people. And yes, there is truth in all these statements, but I always thought that it's better to do something than to do nothing.
You started working on program implementation, as you have said, but then you moved on to high-level policy making. How did that happen? How did you develop these skills? How did you sell the skills that you have from program management to be able to get into the OECD?
For me, it grew organically. Because I had been working a lot on programming, people also started asking me to support the work at the policy level, because they had seen that I had acquired those practical skills, which are very helpful when you're working on policy, because it has to reflect the realities of the people that you are working for. So already towards the end of my assignment at the ILO, I started working on policy. I was part of a team that reviewed, for example, the employment policy of the country. I was part of a team that was rolling out the SDGs in the country, because the SDGs had just arrived actually in different countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And that's how it happened. But then I also realized that the impact that we were having on the ground, it was there. But I also had this frustration that to have maybe a broader vision of what's going on. And I understood that you can only understand that vision if you're working at the higher level and contribute to that. So I wanted to go back to headquarters and to work more at the international level, to be able to contribute to things at a larger scale. I started applying again, because this is of course something that is constant in the international sphere, that you're always looking for the next opportunity. I got lucky again because I had applied for the OECD. I got selected for a job in the Middle East and Africa department, which is attached to the Secretary General office. That was really interesting to me, that type of job, because I got to combine content work also with diplomacy. Those were two sides that I hadn't worked on that much in the past.
How was it working on diplomacy suddenly after working in the field for a long time with local communities, with the government, which of course is a part of diplomacy, but I think it hits differently at the OECD.
Yes, for sure. Something that I learned when I was at the OECD was really around how building the evidence base can actually lead to change. And it's something that I didn't realize that much when I was in the UN. But I think now what I'm seeing in times when there's so much disinformation and misinformation, and let's just say it honestly, denial of basic scientific facts, that an organization like the OECD building that evidence base can actually influence a lot of policy decisions, and I've seen it happen in practice. Another thing, I learned how to function at higher levels of international organizations. For a while I was, for example, in charge of a team that was working on the content of all the high-level engagements that the OECD has with countries in the Middle East and North Africa. When a minister would come from those countries, or the Secretary General would travel to one of these countries. The team that I was leading was preparing the content of those discussions. It was super exciting because you're in a position where you get to influence and to shape the position of the organization on some complex topics like the Middle East conflict, for example. And it's where I also learned that diplomacy happens at different levels. This is just my personal take on things because I was used to working with village chiefs in very remote areas, and suddenly I found myself in the room with ministers and ambassadors. So learning that skill of how to communicate to different audiences in a short amount of time, I think that's very much needed. To me, I've always put in the extra effort, whether I was working for a village chief or whether I was working for a minister. And I think for young people, it's also important to consider that you have always to be professional in whatever environment you are. And it's difficult to grasp those nuances when you are younger, but I got to learn that, I think, over time. Understand that everything is political and how some of those political decisions are being made at those levels. Sometimes there's not a lot of logic in that, or it's not necessarily like the decision that is the most, just decision. It's just what happens in a certain geopolitical context, in a certain scenario. What I also learned at the OECD in those roles working on policy and on diplomacy was to get an overview of how reform really happens at the national level. Because before I had been working more at the subnational level, and here I've been managing, for example, the Egypt country program, which is steering reform through 35 different projects. And so I found myself suddenly working with institutions like the IMF or the EU coming to us and asking me, as you have the overview of this program, what types of recommendations do you have? How should we shape our financial support packages to Egypt? So that was also really interesting experience. And then sitting actually with ministers or deputy ministers who are then telling you, we need support. We have to make these reforms and we're not sure how to do it. And I found that very touching that also people at that level can have that openness and that vulnerability.
So really, it was such a transformative time. I see from your path that because you were in Tanzania and in ILO for around 5 years, you were there long enough to not only learn, but then to put your own style into it, to add your own programming, to shape where that particular program was going. And then you shifted to the OECD with a completely different environment, but you needed to adapt the skills that you had before and you needed to up the emotional intelligence that you had around really high level people. It's a completely different vocabulary and how you relate to someone and even how you dress. You have a very wide variety of skills that you have been acquiring for a long time. Can you tell us a bit more about the difference between working in a sub-national level, as you have mentioned, and then moving to the headquarters and working on a global level or working on the overall MENA strategy?
Something that I've realized is that it's very difficult to get visibility of your work when you're in a field office or when you're not in headquarters. Because I started in headquarters and then I moved to the field. So I was really surprised. I said, how come that I have so many driven colleagues that are doing interesting stuff and it doesn't get picked up in headquarters? It's not discussed in the governing bodies of these organizations. I wouldn't have expected that to be the case. What I've seen is when you're in a field office, you have less bureaucracy, you have less hierarchy, and it has pros and cons because obviously for me the advantage was that I got basically carte blanche for what I wanted to do. There was no one telling me what to do. And it's how I function best if I can have that level of independence and I can be in an environment which is less hierarchical. But when you're in headquarters, it's also valuable to be in that hierarchy and to understand how to work the system and how to get things done despite all those different layers that you have to get across. People who are working in the field, they take a lot of risks. For example, at some point I was asked to develop programs and to go regularly to Burundi, which at the time was a non-family duty station. People started disappearing there. I had been in situations of gunfire when I was in Côte d'Ivoire on a mission, for example. And I've been in very remote and dangerous places in different African countries, and you just do it because it's your job. but it's not the same level of risk-taking when you're in a headquarters. People who are in the field, they have to make those choices every single day. And to me, what I also really enjoyed being in the field is you're much closer to the final beneficiaries. You're actually seeing maybe some of the changes that you can contribute to. And when you're in headquarters, you're very far away from that.
Yes, the impact level is different. Something that you have mentioned before is that you wanted to have a different impact to what you did when you were in Tanzania. But then the other flip of the coin is that you do have that impact, but it's not as tangible and you don't see it as fast as maybe you would when you're doing the programming directly to the people.
Yes.
Which can be frustrating. One of the big parts of your portfolio is your publishing that you have been doing for around 15 years now. Can you tell us how that started? I assume that it was also an effect of the programming that you have done in Tanzania and then continued throughout the OECD and then specialized on gender in particular.
I started already doing some papers and publications when I was at the UN. Because, for example, when I was at the ILO and I started taking on the portfolio on child labor and working with governments, they were always a bit hostile. They were saying, oh, but when we were children, we were also working and it wasn't a problem. So I said, I need to build the evidence base of why addressing this problem is important. So I come with facts that can actually convince people. So I started doing, together with external consultants, research on that. We started collecting hard data through surveys. And then I actually went to the government with that evidence and those facts saying you have almost 30% of children that are in child labor in your country. This is a huge priority. And so then they couldn't ignore that. That's how I learned how to actually work on the evidence base. But then when I arrived at the OECD, obviously the OECD is the mecca of publications. So I said, if I want to be respected within this environment, I have to start writing publications. This is what happened. One of the bigger publications which I worked on was on legal frameworks in support of women's economic empowerment in the Middle East and North Africa. And for that publication, I got very lucky to work with talented colleagues. I had this communications officer who was telling me, yes, this is correct what you're writing, but it's too blunt. You have to wrap the message. You have to know how to communicate this in a diplomatic way, how to convey the message to different audiences. Or this is obvious to you, but it's not obvious to the audience. So I worked very closely with the communications team and I learned those skills along the way, and also with people super specialized in statistics, in data. I've never liked writing just for the sake of writing. To me, there always had to be a purpose behind. It had to be action-oriented. So when this publication is there, when this paper is there, what can we do with this? Another element for me, which was always there in the things that I was writing, was it had to be participatory. It's not just me sitting in a corner doing some research. I have to go out and talk to people. I have to understand the realities, not just from looking for something on the internet. I had some very fascinating exchanges with people on different topics. At some point, I found myself in a Syrian refugee camp in Jordan talking with women refugees and how actually some legal reforms are influencing them and their daily lives. We would think it's very far away from the work that the OECD does, but actually it's not.
There is this competition among the international organizations of who does the best publications. And we can agree, I think, that the OECD and the World Bank are the best ones. What's the value added of the UN? From my perspective, and this is what I have seen through the research that I have been doing on conflict and fragility, is that you have this evidence from the ground. Maybe this is something that is very local, speaking directly to people that people from the OECD, maybe not the World Bank because they have their country offices, cannot do. Can you tell us how you use both of the publications, or how the process of publishing changed for you having been at the UN and then switching to the OECD?
It's a good question, and I think it's actually a broader question of how the OECD, the World Bank, and the UN are different. Because I think we are starting to compete in the same space. And I think right now also with the cuts in funding for development cooperation, it's a key question about what are all the different mandates. But back to the publishing, I agree with you that I think the value added of the UN in terms of doing publications is really getting that information from the field out to a broader audience. Obviously, for the UN, they also have international legal standards. So the importance of reporting on how countries are adhering or not adhering to some instruments, how they are complying with this. For example, there's very valuable reporting on some of the labor-related, some of the gender-related instruments. So I would say that is also very valuable for the UN as well. In the OECD, I think the approach is just different because it's one of the things of our core business. The whole organization is made to do that. The UN, the mandate is much broader, and that's why sometimes I also get angry when people say, oh, but the UN is not useful. The UN is not one animal. There's so many different things that the UN is doing, so you can't just put that into one basket. But what I've seen at the OECD as well is that you get people who are very specialized in a particular topic, which you get maybe a little bit less in the UN. But I'm also seeing an evolution in the OECD in the sense that we used to do very long, very detailed publications, and now there is still that pressure to actually convey messages in maybe 10 pages or like 20 pages. It's also the struggle, I think, that we are facing now, that people want quick and digestible information. But at the same time, it's contradictory because I think the added value of the OECD is just to have that level of depth and that level of detail.
Something that surprised me about my job at the OECD was that everything was based on data and comparison between the countries or between the different settings. And it was done in such a meticulous way, not only in terms of analyzing the data, but then also once the production of the first draft was done, there were so many experts involved to actually do the peer reviewing process, which I have not experienced before that. So it was actually really interesting to see that, yes, it takes a very long time to do a publication. It's not something that you can do in 3 months because there's so many other people involved. You get criticism on your papers, which you always do. That's the point of having the peer reviews. And that was really surprising to me, to how many levels of thinking there are. It's not just I sit down and I do the publication, but it's actually reanalyzing where the paper is going to go based on everyone involved in this process and everyone's experiences. Everyone came together always for the publications to make them better. And I think this is when understanding how they are produced, I appreciated even more the quality of what comes out of the OECD. Maybe it was just the case of my team, but I think it's a standard that is set for the OECD.
No, I agree that the quality control is very important and is really very thorough in the OECD. And also the fact that it has to go through committees. So you actually also get the member countries or the member countries of that particular committee that get a say in what is in your findings. And I found that very helpful, especially when you're writing publications that involve particular countries where perhaps there is less freedom of speech. And then as the OECD, you can have that authority and say it's not our opinion. It's also peer reviewed by many different people. It's been reviewed within the committee. And I think in the UN, from my experience, you get that less because there is already this relation often of the country depending on funding for the UN. So that power relation is different, I would say.
We have seen that you have developed so many different skills, and while the first instance of you getting into an international organization was luck, everything else was strategy and precision in what skills you were developing. For anyone wanting to get into international organizations, what would you advise them to focus on and how to stand out in this very competitive, more and more so, field?
Obviously, in international organizations, we have many different profiles. And sometimes from the beginning of your career, it's not so easy to know what is going to be your comparative advantage, right? And which is the role that you're going to thrive in. In my particular case, the topic of gender equality just clicked with me, and it also aligned with my human rights background. What's very important is to follow your intuition. It's maybe a little bit of a cliche, but I think in many situations, like you cannot plan everything. You cannot control everything. So it's good to have a plan, but also go with the opportunities that are being brought to you along the way. As you said, I think what really helped for me was not to put all my eggs in one basket and to always, in every role that I've had, get the maximum out of it. Every day I was going like 100%, not just doing my job, but also trying to see how can I further develop my skills in a particular area? How can I work on myself as a person? Some things just grow organically, but then next to the organic part, it's also about a lot of hard work and trying to develop yourself in different areas. As we know, the space is becoming more and more competitive as compared to when I just started 15 years ago. You didn't need a PhD. If you had a master's degree, it was fine. Like they would take people as interns who didn't have any field experience. Now everything is changing.
It's very competitive, I can confirm. And a lot of people who try to get into international organizations now really go through such a gruesome process of job searching because they get rejected every time that they apply for jobs. It's 200 plus applications, even with really good degrees that were a guarantee when they were applying for these universities and paying a lot of money to graduate from them, that they are going to be guaranteed a job. I also find that more and more I speak to people on your level, so people who have 15, 20, 25 years of experience, and there is competition too. What would you advise them to do first? Go into NGOs, go into the private sector, start something on their own, start a social impact business?
It's a difficult question because not all of us are privileged. When you get out of your studies, also in my own situation, like I just had to work because who's gonna pay for everything? That's also a big issue when you start, you do internships, like it's not paid a lot of money. I always advise people to do any type of job because you need that experience and you need that financial security. But then obviously when you do have a choice and you have some leeway, I think it's always good to do an internship either in an NGO or in an international organization or in the private sector. And that's actually a topic that I think is going to become more and more important now, like how the private sector is actually contributing to the implementation of the SDGs. Now in many big companies, also in France, if you think about L'Oréal, for example, or some of the bigger banks, they have these strategies of corporate social responsibility and they need to comply with certain environmental and equality goals. So I would actually think that this is also a space for young people to start exploring, because I think that the jobs are going to become less and less. So we need to look into other types of useful things that we can do in this space.
Most people who want to work in international organizations are driven by impact. But as you said, you can have that impact in the private sector within specific directorates or specific sectors of work. Because of the standards that are obviously increasing, which is fantastic, more organizations open these doors for people who could be having impact on a private sector level.
It's also cyclical, I think, because you always have these cycles of expansion and then contraction. This is really the worst moment that I've seen in my 15 years career. But I believe that these movements are cyclical and maybe we're going to get to something more optimistic in a few years, who knows.
One of the big questions working on policy is how do you have an impact? We very briefly had that conversation of it differs because you don't see it immediately. You very often don't see the people who benefit from it. How would you define the impact that you have or you could have, or how could we have more impact with policy?
When you're in the field, it's easy to see the impact because you have removed X number of children from child labor, like you have created jobs for X number of people. But when you're doing policy work, how is the impact actually measured? And it's something that I've struggled with at the OECD, because when I joined the OECD, so I started working with non-member countries, so partner countries in Africa and the Middle East. And we started developing quite large programs with some of those countries. But it was, I wouldn't say a copy-paste from what we were doing with OECD countries, but it was very much inspired by the same mechanisms. And I think that just doesn't apply in different contexts always. There were no precedents. So I had to start thinking of how we can actually have a vision for what we're going to do with a particular country. And from the start, how are we defining the impact that we want to achieve after a certain number of years? It was about creating log frames and indicators and theories of change and stuff like this. But then the hard questions come. Okay, you're gonna have a report, you're gonna have some capacity building, but then so what? How has this actually influenced the reform agenda in a particular context? This is a situation that we are now finding ourselves in this space, that we are very good at bringing out those policy recommendations, doing capacity building with governments, but then how is this actually making a change in people's lives on the ground? And I think we haven't yet mastered how we're gonna get to the part of better policies for better lives. It's really interesting to be in this space and to be part of the reflection around that, because also the countries that you're working with, they have another understanding maybe of what policy level work means and what they want to get out of it. It's so important to align the work of different international organizations because, yes, for example, the OECD can be more active in the space of making those recommendations and then working with the governments and seeing how they can actually apply it. But then you should also work with institutions like the UN, the World Bank, because they're on the ground, so they can actually also take those recommendations, implement them on a day-to-day basis.
Coming onto the topic of navigating motherhood. How do you balance being a single mother and having such a high-pressure career?
It's not been easy, but I think I've developed some strategies over time to deal with the situation because it was a situation that I didn't choose, that I was confronted with. So I had to find ways of how I'm going to handle this and how I'm going to be operational in this space. My strategy was like, I want to be able to function at the same level as anyone else does. And I didn't want to disclose my situation to other people because I felt like if I would do that, they would say, oh, but this person, she will not be able to travel. Or, oh, this person, we're not going to give her that extra responsibility because this and this. So I kept it a lot to myself. And I don't know if it was the right strategy, but it was how I was coping at the time. And then at the same time, I was trying to compensate in my personal life because I also wanted to spend time with my children, right? I started, first of all, I think, opening up to other people about it. It's where I realized that obviously at a certain age, everyone has, we call it like a backpack, right? Things that you have gone through in life and that made you who you are and that made you more resilient and mature and made you a more complete person. We cannot completely separate work and personal life. And it's something that I also learned when I was getting older. We're not robots. We are people with lives and with emotions. To me, I realized quickly that there's not such a thing like a work-life balance. When I had my children, actually from the start, my mother always encouraged me to put work first because that's what's going to help me provide for my family, but it's also what's going to help me take pleasure in life because I enjoy working and I enjoy doing my job. But it means that you are always compromising everywhere because you can only be 100% in one day. So how are you going to attach the different percentages of that 100%? And what also helped me was being militarily organized because you just can't be everywhere, especially when you're an expat. You don't have that village around you. They always say it takes a village to raise a child, and you don't have that because you're in a foreign country. You don't have your family, you don't have your friends. In my situation, I said I just have to hire a full-time nanny because when I wake up in the morning and someone is sick, I can't say, oh, I'm sick, I'm not coming today. It's just not an option. In France, there's so many school holidays. So I can't say at work, I'm not here for 2 weeks because we have the school holidays. It's something that cost me a lot financially, but I've seen it as an investment in my career because if I don't have this fantastic nanny that I have, I wouldn't be able to do the job that I'm doing. So it takes a lot of multitasking, a lot of delegating things, and also I try to educate my children in a way that they also see the value of work. Now they're 12 and 9, so they just know, okay, mom, she's working and she's doing this and she's doing that, and they understand. An important thing that I've learned was that you just can't have it all, but on the outside people think that you do have it all. Like they see someone who they think, okay, she's having a career, she has children, she's at work and she's put together some days, but they don't see that maybe the previous night you had 2 kids with the stomach flu and you were like cleaning vomit all night. I've missed a lot of birthdays, I've missed a lot of school plays, but I think you just have to make those compromises. And the same thing at work. They know that I don't stay in the office past a certain time. I just go home and then people can reach me on my phone or I'll reconnect in the evening. This leads me also to the point that it's important to prioritize and sometimes also to learn to say no. When you're younger, it's harder because you're in that hierarchy. So you're always at the bottom of the chain that you just have to follow the chain of commands. But then when you get older, sometimes you can just say, I think that meeting is not important.
That's probably what a lot of women go through as well, where they don't want to be seen as, oh, I have young children at home, which is why I can't take this project. Or maybe they're afraid that if they do say it one time, then they're not going to be offered the opportunity. I think it's a real struggle that mothers in particular have.
We've come a long way, I think, in international organizations. The space is not at all the same space from when I started. I think now certain remarks or behaviors, they just will not happen anymore in terms of sexist remarks or things that are just inappropriate. Also around motherhood and people being biased, even though it still happens occasionally. I have to say things have been changing. But that being said, I think we've done quite well in encouraging women to have a career, despite the fact that the window of actually making that career and having children overlaps. It's not the same for men, right? Because especially in international organizations, traditionally these jobs were held by men. So they had a partner or wife that would follow them and would take a more important role perhaps in the organization of the family and the education of the children. It's good to encourage women to have a career, but we haven't encouraged men that much to also contribute to unpaid care work and to be more involved in their families. So as long as we don't make that move, there's not going to be any balance. As women, then necessarily we are like combining a career with being a mother, with also looking a certain way, doing sports. There's so many different standards that apply, I think, to women trying to make a career that don't apply to men. So I think that's still something that can be improved.
That's such an important point. And I think we speak a lot about empowerment of women, but the masculinities aspect of gender equality is something that has been overlooked for a very long time. And I think it's a very important point to bring up as well.
Men are also struggling with all these changes, right? And how to behave themselves, maybe being more involved in the family and how this would be perceived. And I think in countries like France or Northern Europe, you're feeling that things are changing, but still.
I have also lived in Kenya and Tanzania, and conversation around gender equality always shocked me because it's such a just day and night in terms of thinking and treatment. Maybe you have experienced that too, but for example, in Tanzania, if I was walking with my male friend, people would ask my male friend to ask me to do something. They wouldn't tell me or ask me what I want to do. They would ask my male friend to tell me to do something. That's the reality for a lot of women. But at the same time, his response saying she can do whatever she wants and she can say whatever she wants was shocking to the men, because then they thought that he is weak because he doesn't have control and he gives the control away.
That's very interesting. And actually, when I was living in Tanzania, people wouldn't call me by my name. They would call me Mama Amina because that was the name of my oldest daughter. So as a mother, you lose your identity to your family, to your children. I also agree with your assessment that you don't have a lot of freedom in those countries. You cannot dress the way you want. You can't say whatever you want. You can't behave in a certain way. I think it's something that we underestimate a lot in Europe, that we have actually that freedom.
Absolutely. And safety too. There has been times that my physical presence have been violated. For example, in Tanzania, there were times when someone would be frustrated with me because, again, I wouldn't do what they want me to do, and they would hit me. And it would be even more shocking to me that someone is dissatisfied in the first place with something that I have the right to say or do, but they go even further to express and feel like they have the right to express their opinion by violating my physical space. It was really hard. What's even harder, because I've studied Swahili for 4 years, I lived with a host family in Zanzibar, I lived in Kenya 2 times, I'm very close to the culture, and I have always been of the opinion that it's me who chooses to be there, which means that I agree to live in a specific setting and environment. And this gender thing was something that I felt the most conflicted on. It wasn't even about how I dress, because I chose to dress respectfully, but the fact that I cannot say something that I feel or think, and then I would be punished by men for that, was really difficult for me. But even more difficult for me was realizing that women don't even know that's an option for them, because they don't. They live in a society where this is taught to them from a very young age. So it was difficult as an experience, as a white woman coming to East Africa and then bringing my own values to the equation, but then choosing to live within a specific environment that doesn't necessarily represent them. And at the end of the day, on one hand, there is obviously universal values that I think a lot of people share, but then who am I to say that gender equality, the way that I perceive it and that I want it, should be implemented in a space that I arrived in? I had a lot of psychological conversations with my friends, both European, Western, but also African, around these topics.
It's also about having to fit in a certain box and having to respond to certain expectations. And it's something I felt very liberated about living in Europe because of my situation, what happened to me when I became a single mother. I felt like I no longer have to respond to any of expectations that society has of me, and it's so liberating. But then when you're living in countries in sub-Saharan Africa, you just have to fit in the box. You have to get married, you have to have children. When you're not in that box, you're like an outcast.
I think it's very difficult for women, and we're lucky that we get to choose. Speaking of the gender issues, how did you see that gender aspect playing out in your professional experiences? On our call, you said that you see this very big distinction between either women who have children very young or women who wait to have children until very late and then they regret not having children before, and there is like nothing in the middle. It's a very interesting observation to have, and a warning maybe for some of the women in particular who want to work in international organizations.
Obviously, everyone has to choose their own path, right? And it's a combination of so many different factors of why you want to have children or not, or at what age. In my situation, it just happened that I became a mother when no one in my environment had children. The other junior consultants I was working with, they didn't have children. It was just a reality that I was confronted with, but the struggle was real because you really have to make a career and have young children at the same time when you have them when you're young. And I think in hindsight, maybe I wouldn't have made the same choices because I felt like I was growing up at the same time as my children were growing up. I still had to learn so many different things about life, about emotional intelligence, about societies more broadly. And I think when you're older, you have like more maturity and you can put things into perspective. But that being said, now I'm also happy they're 12 and 9 and it's so nice. There is no one size fits all. Everyone has to make that decision for themselves. But what I would say is not to be afraid. If you feel like having children and you still have to make a career, just go for it, because work will always be there and there will always be excuses of, oh, and I don't have that fixed term contract, so I shouldn't have children. There's many different considerations that you have to make. So my advice would be like, if you want to start a family, just start a family, because those doubts are always going to be there. But that being said, I think you also have to carefully consider what it comes with being a mother in this type of competitive spaces where there's not necessarily this level of work-life balance, and how you're going to get organized and what's going to be the role of you and your partner in educating your children and taking certain responsibilities.
Another interesting statement that you have made is that before having children, you felt that you were competing on the same level against men, and after children, that's changed.
Yes, I think first of all, there is this maybe sometimes even unconscious bias of people that when they know you have young children, they think you won't be able to travel, or they don't want to give you any additional responsibility. Before having children, you're just a free person. You can go wherever you want, you can do whatever you want without making all these different types of arrangements. But then on the other hand, I've also had a lot of people who started respecting me more when they knew that I had these additional responsibilities, and that tried to, in their own ways, accommodate without being belittling. Some people have these comments like, oh, but women are not supportive of other women and they don't help them grow in their careers. But for me, it's been quite the opposite. The two biggest promotions in my career happened just after I had my two daughters and were given to me by other women.
It's amazing. I love hearing stories of people supporting people, and we need more and more of that, especially in this competitive environment, which is also why I created this space for I Already, because I felt that everyone was competing for the jobs and therefore no one was helping each other. While what I was doing with my friends, if we were competing for the same job, we would share the questions that the first of ones from the interview had, or we would check each other's CV. And I really wanted to create a space where that would be the case, where if I went through something and I would have told that my younger self, I would tell that people that I'm working with, so that this information can inform their decisions. Because this whole world of international organizations is just so mysterious and so unjust. And you wouldn't think that because it's the United Nations or the OECD or the World Bank.
There's a lot of value in also having a life outside of work. Your identity is not only defined by what happens in a workplace. So if you are struggling with a difficult manager or a difficult situation at work, you have still your own space that you can go back to and recharge. It's really wonderful that you have opened up this space for young people to learn more, and that you have been sharing information on competitive processes, and that people have been helping each other, because it's also something I've always applied in my career, to put values over competition, because maybe that job wasn't yours in the first place.
Exactly.
Right? And it's so much more important to be able to look everyone in the eye at the end of a career, at the end of a life, that you say, I did the right thing, over just like doing whatever I wanted to do.
I agree. A lot of people in general in international organizations go through a lot of instability because, as you have mentioned, there are a lot of fixed term contracts, consultancies, some of the internships, unpaid internships. There's just a lot of insecurities with how this career is structured, both in changing countries and in changing contracts, in changing international organizations, navigating this career. Would you have any advice for people who will be in the future navigating these challenges, what you know now from your career and from everyone around you? How would you have prepared yourself better for it?
It's definitely one of the biggest issues that people are facing working in these environments. What I would advise people is to actually realize this from the start. I only realized it when I was maybe 5, 6, 7 years in it, because I was just like, I'm so lucky to be in this environment and chasing one contract after another. But I didn't think about my pension, or I didn't think about what's going to happen if one day I'm without a job. So I always was hustling to get other assignments, consider this issue from the start, and to put some money aside. I know in the beginning of your career, it's almost impossible. At least for me, it was very difficult, but it's something that you have to reflect on, and also to reflect on if this is actually something that you can grapple with. Of course, you have people who would prefer very much just having job security, even though I think in general we are going towards this trend of shorter term contracts in any type of sectors. Build that resilience for dealing with things that just happen in life.
So building resilience and expecting that's a part of the journey when working in international organizations. What's one book or resource that has shaped your approach to leadership or diplomacy?
One book that I really like, it's called The Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power. Samantha Power was the US ambassador to the UN under Obama, and she's explaining about how she had all these big ideals, but then politics just happened and she had to make so many compromises. There's also a podcast that I would very much recommend. It's called Awake at Night by Melissa Fleming, who is the head of communications at the UN in New York. She's interviewing different people that are or have been working at the UN with very interesting profiles. You have, for example, a former nun who then got into the UN, or you have people who basically were in very difficult situations in the field, or people coming even as refugees and then themselves working in the UN with refugees.
Amazing. Definitely something to add to our list. How do you maintain a work-life balance? Do you have any hobbies that are your go-to escape activities?
I really like walking in nature. It's something that gives me energy. I also started cooking a lot because I like to eat, and then I realized that it's actually important to be a good cook if you want to eat well. I like also doing sports.
Looking back at your journey, is there a specific moment or decision that completely changed the trajectory of your career?
There were two defining moments. The first moment was when I decided to move to Rome, because there is where I got so many different opportunities. And the other defining moment is when I had to choose, I think, between the two JPO opportunities, and I chose to go to Tanzania because it really accelerated things in my career.
What would the 20-year-old you be surprised to know about your life today?
To realize that life is not linear. I think when I was younger, I just thought that things were just gonna go like this. But it doesn't always go up. Sometimes it goes down, and that's okay too. Also, that you don't have to fit in a box and you don't have to do what people expect you to do. I think my 20-year-old self would be pleasantly surprised that I'm very happy with my life and with my job, and that you have to trust life also, that something's there for you.
That's a good one. Trust life. If you could have a conversation with your younger self starting out, what advice would you give?
Hard work alone, it's not enough. You need to build those networks, take risks, and not to be afraid to take risks and do stuff that you think it's maybe not in my comfort zone, but this is where actually the learning is gonna happen. Have some sort of a plan, but then to be open to opportunities that come along the way. For me, I think it's very important to don't sacrifice values for a job. So always know who you are and align with that in the workplace. We haven't talked much about this, but it's about seeing the bigger picture. So not just being in your own job, but trying to always understand what is the broader mandate of the organization, what are the broader priorities in this space, because it's going to help you get like the overview of things. Work on yourself as a person, not just as an employee, because I think it's the only thing that's going to set us apart from robots in the future with AI and things like this, that emotional intelligence, that way of dealing with other people.
Who would you like to see on our podcast next?
I don't have anyone particular in mind, but I do think it could be interesting to invite someone from the private sector who has been working on pushing forward the SDGs and to understand better how jobs in the private sector are also now evolving into that sphere.
Okay. We'll need to do some research to find the right person. That's the end of the interview, so thank you very much for sharing all the wisdom that you have acquired throughout the years of experience and for sharing all of the tips. It's really important for people who want to get into this field to know what it comes with, and I feel that our conversations have made it closer to the decision-making process and just an awareness of how life could look like and what are the obstacles that could come people's way. So thank you very much for sharing and for being also very vulnerable about your experiences from this career choice.
Thank you for having me, Wiola. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Diplomatic Changemakers Off the Record. I'm Wiola Stasiuk, and I hope that today's conversation left you inspired and informed about the realities of international diplomacy. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with fellow changemakers. Remember, stay bold, stay diplomatic, and keep changing the world, both on and off the record.